Welcome to this session on grains in the school meals program. We discussed this required component in both the breakfast and lunch meal pattern sessions. In this session, we will provide detailed information that you need to determine that you are in compliance with the whole grain rich requirement and the correct serving size. Let's review the daily and weekly requirements first. The daily requirement for breakfast is a 1 ounce equivalent for grades K through 12, and the 5-day weekly requirement for grades K through 5 is 7 ounce equivalents, grades 6 through 8, 8 ounce equivalents, grades 9 through 12, 9 ounce equivalents. The weekly requirements provide the menu planner flexibility, but for schools that need to plan a menu for grades K through 12, by offering 2 grains daily, you will be in compliance for all grades. At lunch, the grain component minimum daily serving requirement is a 1 ounce equivalent for grades K through 8, and for grades 9 through 12, the minimum daily requirement is a 2 ounce equivalent. Notice again there are weekly requirements that offer the menu planner flexibility. For grades K through 8, you must plan for 8 ounce equivalents for the week, and for grades 9 through 12, 10 ounce equivalents for the week. Since students do not come to the serving line by grade necessarily, the menu planner can plan for a minimum of 2 grains for all students and know they are in compliance with the daily and weekly requirements. Remember, these are minimum amounts. You may plan for extras or more as long as you stay within the dietary specifications for calories. The type of grain products offered is important to meet the grain requirements. At least half of the weekly grains offered at both breakfast and lunch must be whole grain rich, or they can be 100% whole grain. So what is USDA's definition of whole grain rich? Well, it means that 50% of the product must contain whole grains, and the remaining grains in the product must be enriched. So any item that contains more than 50% of the whole grains will meet this requirement, including 100% whole grain products. The other grain items offered during the week must be enriched. Wait a minute. We need to define these terms before we can go any further. What exactly does whole grain rich, and enriched mean? Let's start with the term whole grain first. To understand what the term means, it's important to understand the anatomy of a grain kernel. As shown on this slide, a whole grain kernel has 3 parts: the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. The bran is the outer covering of the kernel that contains fiber, B vitamins, and some minerals. The endosperm is the largest part of the grain kernel. It provides energy in the form of carbohydrates and also contains protein. The germ is the embryo, the reproductive part of the kernel, and it contains antioxidants, vitamin E, and some B vitamins. Whole grains are grains that consist of the entire kernel, all 3 parts. Whole grains are nutrient rich because they contain all of the nutrients listed on this slide. How do you determine whether a grain is whole grain? Labeling and advertising is often confusing and misleading, making people think that many foods are whole grain when they are not. Careful label reading is needed. A list of common whole grains handout is provided with this training and also on our website. If you see whole corn, whole rye flour, and whole wheat flour, you know it's a whole grain. If you don't see the word whole, you will need additional documentation from the manufacturer to determine if these grains are whole. We will discuss this documentation later. There are exceptions. Some grains do not state whole but are whole grains. We will see examples of these on the next slide. Some grain products do not state whole in their description, but they are whole grains. These include the grain ingredients listed on this slide, such as wheat berries, oatmeal, brown rice, millet, and quinoa. On the other hand, this slide shows some grain ingredients that should not be considered whole grains, such as flour, white flour, enriched flour, bread flour, enriched rice. If you are in doubt about an ingredient, please contact the state agency to determine if the grain is creditable. Okay, we have a better understanding of the term whole grain. Now let's talk about the term enriched. Remember this picture? It shows the three parts included in a whole grain kernel. However, as we know, not all grains are whole grains. Some grain products, like white flour and white rice, are made by removing the bran and the germ from the grain kernel, and only the endosperm remains, circled in the purple. This process greatly reduces the nutritional value of the grain. To make up for this loss of nutrients, processors add back some vitamins and minerals to the grain through a process called enrichment. The resulting grain is now referred to as enriched. This slide shows the 5 nutrients, 4 B vitamins and iron added to refined grains during the enrichment process. An enriched grain product provides more nutrition than a refined grain product. However, a whole grain product has even greater nutritional value and is the most healthy option. This slide shows an example of an ingredient statement for bread that contains enriched flour. You can tell it is enriched because it states enriched and lists the 5 enriched nutrients in parentheses. Now we are ready to tackle the biggest term, whole grain rich. Let's remember why this term is important by reviewing an earlier slide. The menus you plan and the grain products you serve may provide enough grains for the daily and weekly requirements. However, you must make sure you are also meeting the grain requirements. When crediting grains for breakfast and lunch, you need to make sure that half of the weekly grains offered meet USDA's definition of whole grain rich, and other grains offered to credit as the grain component are enriched. So it's important for you to know what kind of documentation is needed to determine if items meet this definition and what you need to keep on file to show you are in compliance with this requirement. There are 3 criteria needed to meet the definition of whole grain rich. First, the product must contain at least 50% whole grains by weight. This means a whole grain is the first ingredient, or if water is the first ingredient, the second ingredient must be a whole grain. Second, that remaining grain ingredients are enriched. And third, non-creditable grain ingredients are less than 2% of the product's formula. The product must meet all 3 criteria to be considered whole grain rich. Now, let's talk about how to determine if a grain product is whole grain rich. Documentation is required to demonstrate that you are in compliance with meeting the 50% whole grain rich requirement. Here are some examples of documentation. The product and ingredient list is a good place to start. The first ingredient must be a whole grain, and other grains must be enriched. A child nutrition label provides meal pattern contribution information for commercially prepared and combination food items containing grains. If the product does not have a CN label, then you may request a product formulation statement from the manufacturer. We will discuss these in a few slides. Recipes are documentation So the grains included in the recipe must indicate that 50% or more of the grain is whole grain, and the product can include the USDA approved whole grain health claim on its packaging, and the items contain at least 8 grams of whole grain per ounce equivalent. One more factor to consider when looking at product ingredient lists: for non-mixed items such as breads and cereals, a whole grain must be the first ingredient. For mixed combination items, pizza, chicken nuggets, etc., whole grain must be the first grain ingredient listed by weight. In combination mixed component items, you will generally see meat alternate ingredients listed first and then the grain ingredients. Now let's look at some examples. This label shows whole wheat flour as the first ingredient. The next grain ingredient, enriched unbleached wheat flour, is third on the list, so this product fits the definition of whole grain rich. Manufacturers may apply for a CN label, such as this one, to indicate the number of ounce equivalent grains. The term ounce equivalent grains on the CN label indicates the product meets the whole grain rich criteria. If the term bread or bread alternate is shown on the CN label, that indicates how the item contributes towards the grain credit, but tells you the item may or may not be whole grain rich. Be sure to check the ingredient label. Product formulation statements are developed by manufacturers to provide specific information about their products. They generally include a detailed explanation of what the product contains and the amount of each ingredient in the product by weight. These statements should be written on the manufacturer's letterhead and include the name of the product and the product code number, crediting statements, signed and dated by an official manufacturer. For school-made items, the recipe is used to determine whether the total weight of whole grain ingredients exceeds the total weight of grain ingredients that are not whole grain. In this recipe, the weight of the whole wheat flour and the whole grain cornmeal combined is 1.5 pounds, which exceeds the weight of the enriched flour, 1 pound. Therefore, the cornbread made from this recipe is whole grain rich. Products that have the FDA health claim on them are whole grain. Diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers. Some newer additions to the list of creditable whole grain rich foods in the Child Nutrition Program are corn masa, corn flour, and enriched cornmeal. Corn products made from these ingredients meet the whole grain rich criteria and credit the same way as other grains. Another whole grain addition is popcorn. As a whole grain food, it is a good source of fiber. As you can see, popcorn served by itself would require a large portion size. However, it could be included in a snack mix of popcorn, whole grain rich cereals, and pretzels if participating in the after-school snack program. A total of 2-ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts may be offered per week. Keep the USDA dietary specifications in mind when planning the frequency of desserts. Now let's evaluate some products to see whether they meet the whole grain rich requirements for school meals. You'll be shown a slide with a product and its ingredient list. Based on the information in that ingredient list, determine if that product is whole grain rich. Does the whole grain chicken corn dog meet the whole grain rich definition? Yes, this product is whole grain rich. Corn dogs are combination foods because they contribute to both the grains and the meat alternate components. To review this product for compliance with whole grain rich requirements, we only need to look at the grain ingredients in the batter, the grains component. Whole wheat flour is the first grain ingredient in the batter, and all the other grains, whole grain corn, are whole. Remember that if the first ingredient of a grain product is water, a whole grain may be listed as the second ingredient and still meet the criteria. Does the whole wheat bagel meet the whole grain rich criteria? Yes, this product is whole grain rich. Whole wheat flour is the first and only grain ingredient. This product contains only one non-creditable grain, yellow corn flour, listed after the statement contains 2% or less of, and therefore complies with the non-creditable grains limit. Do these white whole wheat breadsticks meet the whole grain rich definition? Yes, this product is whole grain rich. Whole wheat flour is the first grain ingredient. The second ingredient is enriched flour. This product contains only one non-creditable grain, oat fiber, listed after the statement contains 2% or less, and therefore complies with the non-creditable grain limit. Does the whole grain cereal bar meet the whole grain rich definition? Yes, this product is whole grain rich. Whole grain rolled oats is the first ingredient, and all other grains, crisp brown rice, whole grain rolled wheat, whole wheat flour, and whole corn flour listed are also whole. Here's an example of whole grain rich and non-whole grain rich grains offered over the course of a week. Your job is to make sure that half of the required grains offered for the week meet the whole grain rich requirement. In order to check your menu for compliance, you would add up the total number of grains served for the week, how many were whole grain rich, how many were non-whole grain rich, and compare. Is this menu in compliance with the requirement that at least half of all grain items served must be whole grain rich? Adding up all the grains together for the week total 10. The number of whole grain rich items is 7, and the number of non-whole grain rich items is 3. So yes, this menu meets the requirement. At least half of the grains offered were whole grain rich. Next, let's discuss how to calculate how grain items credit for the school meals program. Besides making sure you meet the whole grain rich requirement, you must also meet the daily and weekly minimum serving sizes of this component. And USDA has guidelines to determine how grain items credit. How do you calculate grain servings? There are a couple of ways to do this. First, you must determine the weight of your product, either from the package, or a standardized recipe, or by weighing the item. For weighing, you will need a scale. We recommend a digital scale, and there are inexpensive models to purchase. Then the next step is to refer to the grain bread chart. This handout is available on our website. The chart comes out of the USDA Food Buying Guide, so for additional information, you may refer to the Grains chapter of the guide. I recommend you print a copy of this chart to follow along and keep a copy handy for future reference. We can determine how grain items contribute to meal pattern by what an item weighs and then finding which group the item is in. The chart shows different groups, types of grain items, their portion sizes in ounces and grams, and how the items credit. There are 16 grams of creditable grain ingredients in a 1 ounce equivalent. Each group shows what the weight of an item needs to be in order to credit a 1 ounce equivalent or 1 grain serving. The chart is divided into 9 different groups, A through I. Items are placed in these groups based on the amount of grain compared to the other ingredients. So Group A, bread type coating, hardly any other ingredients, so 0.8 of an ounce credits as a 1 ounce equivalent. Group B contains a larger portion of items that are typically served in the school meals program. bagels, bread, all types of buns, taco shells, corn chips, etc. In this group, a 1 ounce portion credits as 1 ounce. This is an easy group since the items credit ounce for ounce. So, how do we use the chart? First, you weigh your item with your digital scale, and then you compare to the correct group on the chart. Or you may have to do a little math. The math equation to determine how items credit is to take the weight of your grain item and divide it by the weight equivalent to 1 serving from the appropriate group, and this will equal the number of grain servings. If rounding is needed, you will always round down to the nearest 1/4 serving. Let's go through an example of a homemade cinnamon roll that weighs 2.5 ounces. So we want to determine how that credits towards meal pattern. So what group are cinnamon rolls in? The chart shows a sweet roll, unfrosted, in Group D, and a sweet roll, frosted, in Group E. So we weighed our roll before we frosted it. So the correct group is D. And a 2 ounce portion size credits as 1 grain serving or ounce equivalent in Group D. So using the equation we just discussed, the 2.5 ounce roll will be divided by 2 ounces and equals 1.25. We don't need to round down, so the roll credits as 1.25 or 1 1/4 ounce equivalent. The example is a hoagie bun that weighs 3 ounces. As I mentioned, all types of buns are in Group B. So in this group, a 1 ounce or 28 gram portion size equals a 1 ounce equivalent or 1 grain serving. So doing the math, the 3 ounce portion size divided by 1 equals 3 grain servings. Now let's look at a muffin. What group is a blueberry muffin in on the chart? Group C or Group D? All muffins except corn are in Group D. So in this group, a 2 ounce portion size, or 55 grams, equals a 1 ounce equivalent. We could just look at the chart and see that 1.5 ounce muffin credit says 3/4 ounce equivalent. If we needed to do the math, it would be the weight of the muffin, 1.5, divided by 2, equals 0.75 grain servings. If you purchase muffins, you will see on the package or labeling information how they credit. If you make them from a recipe or a mix, you can weigh the muffin and do the math. Then document this on your recipe. Whether or not the muffin is whole grain rich will depend on the ingredients, so you will need that documentation also. Desserts are allowed and can credit toward the grain component. So let's look at cookies. Here's an example of a Snickerdoodle cookie. What group are cookies in on the chart? Well, they too are in 2 different groups. Cookies with stuff in them, such as nuts, raisins, chocolate chips, are in Group E. But plain cookies are in Group C. So a 1.2 ounce or 34 grams equals a 1 ounce equivalent in Group C. Again, we could just look at the chart and know that we have to round down since our cookie weighs less than 1.2 ounces, so the next quarter serving size is 3/4. Doing the math, the weight of the cookie, 1 ounce, divided by 1.2 equals 0.83. We must round down, so the answer is 0.75 or 3/4 of a grain. Pasta is a favorite of students. If you are serving your pasta separate than your sauce, you can determine how it credits based on the portion size you serve the students. What group is pasta in on the chart? Group H. And this states that a half a cup of cooked pasta credits as a 1 ounce equivalent, or 1 ounce of dry or 28 grams of dry credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So if you are serving your students 1 cup of spaghetti, it credits as 2 grain servings. The food buying guide provides information on different types of pasta and how many pounds should be prepared to meet the planned serving size you have determined. If it is the only grain on the menu, you need to meet the daily minimum requirements. Granola bars can be served in the school meals program, at breakfast, lunch, and in the after-school snack program. It's important to know how they credit. Not all bars credit the same. So what group on the chart will you find them? They are called cereal bars, and they again are located in 2 different groups, depending on whether they are plain or have nuts or chocolate chips in them. Cereal bars with nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate chips are in Group E. This group states a 2.4 ounce or 69 gram portion size equals a 1 ounce equivalent. Doing the math, a 1 ounce portion divided by 2.4 equals 0.427. We need to round down to 0.25, so the bar credits as 1/4 of a grain serving. There are cereal bars with child nutrition labels that provide documentation on how they credit. Without this documentation, bars will credit based on their weight. There are bars that do not have enough grain in them to be credited as a grain serving, so make sure you know how your cereal bars credit. Thank you for viewing this session. Hopefully you feel confident that you can plan menus to meet the grain component requirements. Should you need additional information, the online food buying guide is a great resource, or feel free to call the Nutrition Service office with your questions. Thank you for viewing this session. Hopefully now you feel confident that you can plan menus to meet the grain component requirement. Should you need additional information, please feel free to use the online food buying guide for more information, or that's just redundant.